interview is part of the History Heard project. The content of this interview may be used for historical research. However, no part of the video itself may be reproduced without the express written permission of an authorized representative of History Heard or Joel Engel. Today is July 1st, 2009 at 3 p.m. This is an interview with Joel Engel in Armonk, New York. He was born on February 4th, 1936 in New York City, New York. At what point did you realize that it was that cell phone technology would have such a big impact on society?
Well, as a matter of fact, the very first systems that were put together really were just professional people, business people using it. It took, I would say, maybe 3 or 4 years before people started to get them for their private cars. We convinced some of the automobile manufacturers to actually build telephone systems telephones as an option into their cars, Cadillacs and Lincolns and stuff like that. Nobody was buying them, except, doctors and people who were using their cars professionally. And I can tell you the day that I personally came to think of it as a consumer product rather than as a business product. This was after the breakup of AT&T, and I went out to Chicago to the regional Bell Telephone Company out there, to set up their R&D organization, because Bell Laboratories was over on the AT&T side, and the telephone companies didn't have R&D. So I established an R&D organization for them, and I was out there, and I was at a meeting downtown that included dinner, and my wife, who also worked at Ameritech, worked way out in the suburbs, and it was about a 45-minute drive to our back home. And there was this huge snowstorm, and traffic was all tied up and everything, and you were hearing about accidents on the road and everything. And I kept calling home, and she wasn't home yet. And I was imagining all kinds of things. Now, I had a phone in my car because the telephone company had given it to me as an officer of the company, as a perk. The very, very next day. She finally got home, and I finally reached her. And the very, very next day, I arranged to have a phone put in her car. And that's when, for me, it became a consumer product.
Yeah. A common misconception is that you received the first cell phone call?
Well, there's one of the big competitors of ours was a company named Motorola that I'm sure you're familiar with. And before the cellular system came in, and I talked about these primitive systems, okay? There were 2 kinds of primitive systems. One was a telephone. You picked it up, you got dial tone, you dialed the number, and you connected the telephone. That was probably 3 or 4% of the mobile radios. The other 90+% were what were called dispatch, taxi fleets and delivery trucks and repair trucks. And typically what would happen if somebody would have a repair company to repair air conditioners, for example, and he had a dozen trucks. He would install an antenna on his roof with a transmitter and everything, and he'd have cars, radios in his trucks and everything, but he's an air conditioner guy. He didn't know anything about radios. So he would go to Motorola. Motorola was the IBM of that industry. And Motorola would figure out how big a coverage area he needed, where his customers were, and how much power they needed to transmit. And then they would
some iced tea and some melons, because we're all having.
I'll bring some in. I'm fine, thanks though.
If you do.
Thank you though.
Okay. And then they wouldn't even sell them the equipment. They would lease it to them, and they would maintain it and everything. And they were afraid. This was a time when the Japanese were beginning to enter into the electronics market. they were afraid that if you had this cellular system where the telephone company built all the towers, you
Yeah.
didn't have to invest, and the FCC produced a list of mobile radios that would work in that system, that were what we call type accepted and were
Right.
guaranteed to work, Motorola would lose its competitive edge. You
Yeah.
could buy from anybody. And so they fought us tooth and nail. And they went to the FCC first and they said a cellular system wouldn't work. Then they said that it's going to be used frivolously, whereas dispatch is an important commercial service. They foresaw that teenagers would be texting, okay?
How did they know?
Actually, they didn't. And so they fought us tooth and nail. Finally, when it became obvious that they were going to lose, what they did was when we built the test system in Chicago, which is where Motorola is located. They thought we built it into Chicago to sort of, give it to them, okay? That was not the case. The reason we built it in Chicago was there was a Bell Labs out in Chicago that it was where the switching was all being developed, and so there was engineers there 24 hours a day to babysit the system.
Right.
So they decided that they were going to one up on us, and they built a test system very similar to ours in Washington, D.C. And the vice president at Motorola at that time, who was working on cellular telephone, was a guy named Marty Cooper. Okay? And Marty Cooper says that when the system in Washington was installed, that he made the first call on it to me. Okay? I don't remember. He says he made the second call to Dick Frankiel, the other guy who worked on it. He doesn't remember either. Now that doesn't mean it didn't happen. The reason we don't remember is it was no big deal to us. We had already built a system in Chicago. We had made calls all over the place. So this was no big deal. Now, the difference was all of the calls that we made were using telephones that were mounted in cars. Okay? The most important reason was with the cells that were so big to start out a system, you had to make them as big as you could for the cost purposes, as I described earlier.
Right.
If you need to cover a whole metropolitan area, try to do it with as few towers as possible, which means that they have to be able to cover a big area. And so the power that we required from 10 watts from the set, if you were to use a little battery like this, you could probably make a 30-second call and then the battery's dead.
Right.
You had to do it from a car, and the engine had to be running, because if the engine wasn't running, you would again be draining the battery. But Motorola wanted to do something different from us, and they had made the handy talkies for the Army during World War II and during the Korean War. And so they took one of those and they adopted it to the mobile radio frequencies, the cellular frequencies that we were using, and they had a handheld. So he made the first handheld cellular call. Actually, it wasn't even the first handheld mobile call, because in the pre-cellular primitive system, there were people who would take the phone that we had designed for a car, and they would have their local radio electronics company mounted in an attaché case. Okay, and they would so there were these handheld phones before, but it was the first handheld cellular call. Okay, so but again, I don't remember it. Okay, but that wasn't the first call, because there had been so many calls previously on our system. But I keep getting asked that question all the time.